Welcome to the Shutter. I got two stories for you today. Both of them are kind of short. The second story is a collaboration with Cam Buckner from Dixie Cryptid. We said we would do another one. The first one we did went over real well, and it's a treat for me because who tells a story better than Cam Buckner? I mean, the man is just incredible. But this first story is an account, and it's taken from a couple, and I'm going to narrate it as it was written by the researcher that took it. So, get back and settle in. A young grocery store clerk in Weaverville, Trinity County, California, took me to a point at which he came upon a light-colored Sasquatch during the winter of 1994. It was not far from the Big Bar ranger station where he and his girlfriend used to park and make out after work. Engaged in some heavy petting, they were interrupted by the rocking motion of his Chevy Camaro. They looked around, thinking this was one of their friends or other kids screwing around with them, but the windows were pretty fogged up and there was little visibility. Determined to confront the intruder, the young fellow bounced out of the Camaro screaming, "Knock it off!" in a most assertive tone, only to find himself face to face in pitch dark with a hulking figure he described as a bit taller than he was. Stunned, the kid backed up into the open door and froze. He said the Bigfoot, with his left fist, wailed on the roof of his Camaro, beating it at least 3 times and denting it. The young man recalls, "I heard it breathing. Man, I'm telling you, it was alive. Scary stuff. I could hear it breathing." The informant called to his girlfriend inside the car in what she later described as 3 octaves higher than his usual voice, telling her to lay on the horn. Upon hearing the sound of the horn, the Sasquatch sidestepped, backing away from the car, and started at the kid. I couldn't see his eyes or facial features, but it was clear he was facing me and looking at me. Even as dark as it was, he was only lit up by the car door light. The terrified kid said he got in the car, locked the doors, started the engine, and did a quick U-turn on Big Bar Dump Road. Amazingly, he said the Sasquatch followed them up the road, where it turns into Carroll Bottom Road, keeping pace with the car for several hundred feet, before trailing off where they could no longer see it. I spoke with the 2 informants at JC Cafe in Junction City for more than 2 hours. Their account never wavered, and they still showed great fear in recalling the event. The female witness never actually saw the creature, but she heard its raspy breathing. It was evidently too dark to give much of a description other than what he could see of the creature illuminated by the Camaro's door light. He knew right away what he was looking at, but in the shock of the moment, he was able to distinguish very little. Responding to my question, "Did you see a reflection from its eyes in the car light?" he replied there was no color or light emitting from its eyes. There was no smell from the creature, and he could not tell if it was male or female, only that it was this humongous, dark, towering image that he could hear breathing quite heavily and with angry intensity. He said it kept pace with his Camaro to about 20 miles an hour, then it trailed off, but he wasn't sure of his speed. His girlfriend, amazed by it all, only saw a blurred image through foggy windows. A happy ending to this story, though. The young amorous couple are now married and expecting twins.
In the early 80s, my grandparents lived in a 2-story house in a small community in eastern Kentucky. We would spend many weekends there as kids. I had a room in the back of the house that was always full of stored items and old furniture. One day, my grandmother decided she wanted to clean out that room and make a bedroom for their growing number of grandchildren. Of course, my brother Pete and I had dibs on it. They got the room fixed up. One weekend, I was staying there by myself. I was 10 and Pete was 12 at the time, and he was off at baseball camp. We helped my grandmother with the little odd jobs around the house, so we usually got what we wanted. The very first night I stayed in the new room, I was awakened around midnight by the sound of what I thought was a puppy whining. It sounded like it was coming from the corner by the window. I got up to see what it was, and as I got closer, I could hear that it was not a puppy, it was a baby crying. When I got to where I thought it was coming from, it stopped. I went back to the bed and I didn't hear it again that night. I told my grandmother the next day, but she just played it off as being some animal outside. The next night was Saturday. We had stayed up late playing cards, and I went to bed around 11:30, and as soon as I got in the bed, I started hearing it again. This time it was clear. This was no animal. It was a baby crying. I went to my grandparents' room and woke my grandmother. I told her what I was hearing, so she came to the room to listen, but it had stopped when she got there. She stayed for a while, but it never started again. I went back home that Sunday evening, and I thought nothing more of it. A few weeks passed, and Pete was home from camp. We were staying at our grandparents' house for the weekend, and I remembered the baby crying, so I told Pete about it.
When Randy told me about hearing the baby crying, I told him he was hearing things. That is, till the first night I stayed in the room with him. It was midnight, and I was awakened by the sound that Randy had described. I got him up to tell him, and we both heard it clearly. I got dressed, grabbed my granddad's light, and went outside to look around the back by the window. I couldn't find anything or hear the crying from outside now, though Randy could still hear it from inside. By the time I got back in, it had stopped, and we didn't hear it again the rest of the night. The next night, we convinced Grandma to stay in there with us. She brought in her rocking chair and told us stories until we fell asleep. She sat there waiting to hear the crying, and sure enough, just before midnight, she heard it. She woke us both up, and we could hear it too. We looked all over the house and outside, but just couldn't locate the source. Grandma thought it must be coming from under the house. Some animal must have gotten under there and had babies, and it just sounds like an infant crying. Grandma wasn't letting either of us go under there, so she called our dad and told him about it. Dad agreed he'd go under there and look when he came to pick us up on Sunday.
Dad showed up Sunday with his work clothes on. We showed him about where we thought we heard the crying. He removed a skirt panel that was close to there and crawled under with a flashlight. He was under there for a good 30 minutes, and we could hear him bumping around under there, and Grandma was yelling to him, asking if he had found anything. He yelled back that there was no animal, but he did find something.
A few minutes later, he came out from under the house and told Grandma to tell us to stay inside. We couldn't understand what was going on or why we couldn't see what he found. When he crawled to the area under the bedroom, he didn't see any animals, but did see a piece of cloth sticking out of the ground. He took his claw hammer and dug it up. When he crawled out with the cloth, me and Randy were watching from the front porch. I can see it was definitely something wrapped up in a piece of cloth that was falling apart.
As soon as I saw the cloth, I shouted at him, "Dad, what is that?" He shouted back for us to get in the house, so of course we did. While we were inside, Grandma convinced him to tell us what he'd found. When they came in, Dad told us. When he brought out the cloth, he opened it, and inside was the skeletal remains of an infant child. He said they looked very old, at least 50 years.
That house was built in the early 1880s and had been added onto several times. A few families had lived there in the last 100 years. They guessed that the baby was stillborn and was buried there before the back part of the house was added on. They never did let us see it. Dad built a small box for the remains, and his crew came out and dug a 6-foot deep hole out by a big oak in the back field.
They called the preacher and held a graveside service for the baby. They put the box in the hole and said a prayer. Pete and I put the first handfuls of dirt on the box. We also went down to the creek and found a big rock for a headstone. We didn't know if it was a boy or a girl, so we got a chisel out and just scratched out the word baby.
If this all sounds unbelievable to you, trust me, I get it. But all three of us heard that baby crying, and finding those remains in that same spot was no coincidence. We're not sure exactly what happened to that baby, but we never did hear the crying again. I just love doing these stories with Cam. He's such a great storyteller. He's a good friend and just a good man. I really appreciate him sacrificing his time to do these recordings here with me for the Shutter. Okay, if you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you do subscribe, make sure you hit that notification bell so you can join me here next time for the Shutter.